Chapter 1. The Phone Call That Ended a Marriage. The hum of the hotel air conditioner blended with the faint noise of Atlanta traffic drifting up from the streets 20 floors below. Lloyd Franklin sat at the small desk beside the window, his laptop open, several spreadsheets glowing on the screen. Columns of numbers stretched endlessly across the monitor: shipping delays, freight costs, warehouse inventory reports. To Lloyd, they were more than numbers. They were patterns, systems, problems waiting to be solved. He leaned back slightly in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he studied a logistics model for one of his clients. A manufacturing company in Ohio had been bleeding money for months because their supply chain was a mess. Too many middlemen, too many inefficient routes. Lloyd had already spotted 3 ways to cut their costs by 15%. He reached for his coffee, only to realize the cup had been empty for nearly an hour. Typical. When he worked, the rest of the world faded into the background. The room itself was neat and quiet. His suitcase rested open on the luggage stand. A pressed shirt hung neatly from the closet door. The television was off. Lloyd preferred silence when he worked. At 52 years old, he had spent decades building a reputation as one of the most reliable supply chain optimization consultants in the industry. Companies paid him well because he solved problems others couldn't. But solving business problems was always easier than dealing with personal ones. His phone vibrated suddenly against the desk. The sharp buzz pulled him away from the spreadsheet. He glanced down. The screen displayed a familiar name. Claire, his wife. Lloyd checked the time in the corner of his laptop screen. Nearly 9:30 p.m. in Atlanta. Back home, it would already be late. Claire usually called during his trips just to check in. Sometimes she asked how the meetings went. Sometimes she reminded him to bring something back from the airport gift shop. It was routine, comfortable. Lloyd picked up the phone and answered casually. "Hey," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything okay?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough for Lloyd to notice. Claire normally filled silence quickly. She was the kind of person who liked conversations to flow constantly. But tonight the line felt still. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different. Flat, cold. "Lloyd," she said. No greeting, no warmth, just his name. Lloyd straightened slightly in his chair. Something about her tone made him instinctively close the laptop halfway. "What's going on?" he asked. Another pause. Then she spoke again. "I'm divorcing you." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. For a brief moment, Lloyd thought he might have misheard her. "What?" "I said I'm divorcing you," Claire repeated, her voice steady. "I've already started the paperwork." Lloyd didn't respond immediately. Outside the window, a police siren wailed somewhere in the distance before fading away. Inside the room, the silence stretched between them. After 24 years of marriage, Lloyd had imagined many conversations with his wife. This had never been one of them. Finally, he said quietly, "Where is this coming from?" But Claire wasn't finished. "You should also know something else," she continued. Her tone remained calm. Too calm. "I sold the apartment." Lloyd blinked slowly. "You did what?" "I sold it," she repeated. "The paperwork is already in motion. The sale will close soon." He stared at the wall across from him, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Our apartment?" he asked. "Yes, our apartment," Lloyd repeated carefully. "That we both own? That won't matter for long," Claire said dismissively. Lloyd leaned forward now, elbows resting on the desk. "Claire, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about starting over." Her voice carried a strange note of excitement now. "I'm tired of the life we've been living." He waited. She continued. "I'm tired of being married to someone who's never home," she said. "You're always traveling, always working, always thinking about numbers and contracts and warehouses." "That's my job," Lloyd replied quietly. "Yes," she said sharply. "And I'm done living in the shadow of it." Lloyd exhaled slowly. This conversation would make a lot more sense if we had it in person. "There's no need," she said. "Everything has already been decided." Then she delivered the next line with deliberate clarity. "There's someone else." Lloyd closed his eyes for a moment. The words weren't shouted. They weren't emotional. They were delivered like a business announcement. "What's his name?" Lloyd asked. Jerome. The name hung in the air. We've been seeing each other for a while, Claire continued. How long is a while? That doesn't matter. It matters to me. Another pause. Long enough, she finally said. Lloyd opened his eyes again. Across the room, the city lights flickered through the glass window. He tried to picture his wife sitting somewhere at home making this call. Was she standing in the kitchen? On the couch? Was Jerome there with her? You're serious about this, Lloyd said. Yes. And you sold the apartment. Yes. And you expect me to come home and what? Pack your things, she said simply. Officer Grant stepped closer again. The child found in the vehicle is approximately 3 years old. David stared at him. I just told you I don't have a kid. The officer's eyes narrowed. Are you saying the child doesn't belong to you? Of course it doesn't belong to me, David said, baffled. I've never even seen this kid. The female officer flipped a page in her notebook. Then why is the car registered to you? David ran a hand through his hair. I told you, I sold it to my ex-wife. Do you have documentation for that? The officer asked. Yeah, somewhere, David said. I mean, there was a bill of sale. She was supposed to transfer the title. Officer Grant's tone grew sharper. Sir, at this moment, a child is in a hospital fighting for his life after being left inside a vehicle that legally belongs to you. David's heart began to pound. This is a mistake, he said. You need to talk to my ex-wife. Where is she? The officer asked. I don't know, David replied. We haven't spoken in years. The officers looked unconvinced. Officer Grant nodded to the other officer. Then he looked back at David. Mr. Mitchell, based on the information we currently have, you are being placed under arrest for child endangerment. David felt like the ground had dropped beneath his feet. What? Before he could react, the officer stepped forward. Turn around, sir. You've got to be kidding me, David said, panic creeping into his voice. I didn't do anything. Turn around. David looked from one officer to the other. This is insane, he said. I don't even know what kid you're talking about. The officer gently but firmly grabbed his arm. Sir, please cooperate. Cold metal cuffs snapped around David's wrists. The sound echoed in the quiet driveway. Across the street, the couple on the porch stood up. Another neighbor stepped outside their house. Within seconds, several people were watching, whispering, staring. David's face burned with humiliation. This is a mistake, he kept saying. You've got the wrong guy. The officers began guiding him toward the patrol car. I don't even have a kid, David repeated desperately. No one responded. The back door of the police car opened. David looked back at his house, his quiet garage, the half-repaired engine, the peaceful morning that had existed just minutes earlier. Now everything felt unreal. As the officers placed him inside the car, David's voice cracked with frustration. I don't even have a kid, but the car registration said otherwise. And the child was fighting for his life. Chapter 2, The Ghost from My Past. The ride to the police station felt longer than it actually was. David sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his wrists cuffed behind him, staring through the metal divider at the quiet road passing by outside the window. His heart was still racing, and the confusion in his head refused to settle. This couldn't be happening. A child left in a car. His car. None of it made sense. The officer driving kept his eyes on the road, saying nothing. The female officer in the passenger seat occasionally glanced back at David, studying him as if trying to decide whether he was a liar or simply someone caught in a strange situation. David leaned his head back against the seat and exhaled slowly. Think. Somewhere in this mess, there had to be a simple explanation. He had sold that SUV. He remembered it clearly. It had been part of the divorce settlement. He didn't even want the vehicle anymore because it reminded him of the life he had lost. Tara had insisted she needed it, and he had agreed just to end the arguments. He squeezed his eyes shut briefly. Tara. Even thinking her name felt like reopening an old wound. The patrol car pulled into the station parking lot, and David felt the vehicle slow before finally stopping. The back door opened. Step out carefully, the officer said. David slid out awkwardly with his hands still cuffed behind him. Inside the station, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paperwork. Officers moved around the building, answering phones, typing reports, speaking quietly with one another. David was guided down a hallway and into a small interview room. A plain metal table sat in the center. 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. The officer removed the cuffs and gestured for him to sit. "Stay here," he said. The door closed behind them with a dull click. David rubbed his wrists slowly. His mind was spinning. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to piece together what was happening. His peaceful morning felt like a distant memory now. A few minutes later, the door opened again. 2 detectives stepped inside. One was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a calm but serious expression. The other was a younger woman holding a tablet. The older detective sat across from David. "David Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes," David replied. "I'm Detective Alvarez," the man said, nodding toward his partner. "And this is Detective Kim." David nodded quietly. Detective Alvarez folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to clarify a few things regarding the incident this morning." "I'd like that," David said quickly, "because there's been some kind of mistake." Detective Kim tapped on the tablet and turned the screen slightly so David could see it. An image of a vehicle appeared. The moment David saw it, his stomach dropped. A silver SUV. He knew it instantly. "Recognize this vehicle?" Alvarez asked. David nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the SUV where the child was found earlier today." David leaned closer to the screen. The same small dent on the rear bumper. The same roof rack. There was no doubt. "That's mine," David said automatically. Then he quickly shook his head. "I mean, it was mine." Detective Alvarez raised an eyebrow. "Explain." David ran a hand across his face. "I sold that car 2 years ago," he said, "during my divorce." "To whom?" "My ex-wife," David answered. Detective Kim typed something into the tablet. "What's her name?" "Tara Mitchell," he said, then corrected himself. "Well, Tara Brennan now, I think." The detectives exchanged a quick look. David noticed. "What?" he asked nervously. Detective Alvarez slid a printed document across the table. "According to DMV records, the vehicle is still registered under your name." David stared at the paper. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Alvarez asked calmly. "Yes," David insisted. "I signed the car over to her during the divorce settlement. She said she'd handle the title transfer. But the registration was never changed," Kim said. David leaned back in his chair, stunned. "That doesn't make any sense." He remembered that day clearly. The lawyers had been sitting across from each other in a cold conference room. Papers stacked everywhere. His marriage ending one signature at a time. Tara had asked for the SUV. She said she needed it for work. David hadn't argued. He had just wanted everything to be over. "You're saying you sold the vehicle, but never confirmed the registration transfer?" Alvarez asked. "I trusted her to handle it," David said bitterly. The detectives made notes. Then Alvarez spoke again. "There's something else you should know." David's stomach tightened. "The child found in the vehicle has been identified." David swallowed. "Okay, the child's name is Marcus Brennan, Jr." The name hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, David didn't breathe. "Marcus Brennan?" he repeated slowly. Detective Kim nodded. "Yes." David leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Of course it was him. Marcus Brennan. The name he had spent years trying to forget. Marcus Brennan had worked with Tara at her marketing job. At first, David had thought he was just a coworker. Then the late nights started. The secret phone calls. The work trips. Until one night, David found the messages. Hundreds of them. Romantic. Intimate. Betrayal written in plain text. Marcus Brennan wasn't just a coworker. He had been Tara's affair partner. The man who helped destroy David's marriage. Detective Alvarez studied David carefully. "You know him?" David let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah," he muttered. "Ow?" Kim asked. David leaned forward again, his expression darkening. "He's the guy my ex-wife was sleeping with." The room fell quiet. Detective Alvarez and Kim exchanged another glance. "And you're certain about that?" Alvarez asked. David nodded. "Very certain." Detective Kim tapped a few more notes into the tablet. Then Alvarez spoke again. "Well, that brings us to another important detail." David looked at him warily. "The child found in the vehicle," the detective said carefully, "is Marcus Brennan's son." David froze. "His son?" "Yes." David felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Marcus Brennan. Tara. A child. 3 years old. His mind began connecting the timeline. 2 years since the divorce. 3-year-old child. The numbers made his stomach churn. "Oh my God," he whispered. Detective Alvarez watched him closely. "Mr. Mitchell, is there something you'd like to tell us?" David shook his head slowly. "No." He looked back at the photo of the SUV on the tablet. The car he had once owned. The car that had somehow dragged him back into a life he thought he had escaped. Tara. Marcus Brennan. A child left in the heat. And now his name was attached to all of it. David leaned back in his chair again, feeling a cold weight settle in his chest. The past he thought he escaped had suddenly returned. And now it's threatening to destroy his life again. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Blamed Everyone Else. The interview room had grown painfully quiet. David sat with his arms resting on the metal table, staring at nothing while the detectives quietly stepped outside to make a few calls. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it should have. Marcus Brennan's son. The words kept echoing in his head. It felt surreal that after 2 years of rebuilding his life, the names he had tried so hard to forget were suddenly back in front of him again. Tara, Marcus, and now a child. David leaned back in the chair and rubbed his temples. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, adding to the dull pressure building in his head. After several minutes, the door opened again. Detective Alvarez walked in holding a folder while Detective Kim followed behind him. Alvarez sat down across the table. "We've located Tara Brennan," he said. David's eyes lifted immediately. "Where?" "At Greenridge Shopping Center," Kim answered. "About half a mile from where the vehicle was parked." David blinked in disbelief. "She was shopping?" The detectives exchanged looks. "Yes," Alvarez said flatly. "Security footage confirms she entered the store about 45 minutes before the child was discovered." David stared at him. "So she just left the kid in the car?" Kim nodded. "That appears to be the case." David leaned back again, letting out a slow breath through his nose. "Unbelievable. Is the child going to be okay?" he asked quietly. "The paramedics stabilized him," Alvarez replied. "He's currently at the hospital. Doctors say he was suffering from heat exhaustion, but they're optimistic." David nodded slowly, relief mixing with anger. "Good." Detective Alvarez opened the folder. "We spoke with Tara a few minutes ago." David already had a bad feeling. "And?" he asked. The detective sighed. "She claims the situation is your fault." David laughed once in disbelief. "My fault? That's what she said?" Kim confirmed. Alvarez continued. According to her statement, she believed the vehicle registration had already been transferred into her name. David scoffed. "That's a lie." The detective raised a hand slightly. "She also claims you never completed the paperwork properly during the sale." David leaned forward, frustration rising. "That's ridiculous. I signed everything. She was the one responsible for finishing the title transfer." Alvarez watched him carefully. "She says you neglected to remove your name from the registration." David's voice sharpened. "That's not how it works. When you sell a car, the buyer transfers the title. She promised she would handle it." Detective Kim tapped on the tablet again. "Well, right now the official record still lists you as the owner." David shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable." He could almost hear Tara's voice in his head. That same tone she used whenever she twisted the truth to make herself look innocent. Even after everything that had happened between them, she still hadn't changed. "She left a 3-year-old kid in a hot car," David said angrily. "And somehow she's blaming me?" Alvarez didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slid another paper across the table. "This is the current vehicle registration." David looked down at it. His name sat there in black ink. "Owner, David Mitchell." The sight made his stomach twist. "This is exactly why we needed to bring you in," Alvarez said. David rubbed his face again. "She was supposed to transfer it," he muttered. "Do you have any proof of the sale?" Kim asked. David thought for a moment. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Actually, I think I do." Both detectives looked up. "The bill of sale should still be at my house," David continued. "And I might have text messages from her about transferring the title." Alvarez leaned back slightly. "If you can provide those, it would help clarify the situation." David nodded quickly. "I can." Kim typed something into her tablet. Outside the room, faint voices echoed in the hallway. Phones rang. Someone laughed briefly. The normal sounds of the station felt strange considering the storm David felt like he was trapped in. Then the door opened again. Another officer stepped inside. "Detective," he said quietly. Alvarez stood and stepped out with him. David couldn't hear the full conversation, but he caught a few words. "Media already picked it up. Local reporters, child endangerment." David's stomach sank. A minute later, Alvarez returned, his expression slightly more serious. "What is it?" David asked immediately. "The story is already spreading," the detective said. David frowned. "What story?" Kim turned the tablet around again. On the screen was a news website. A bold headline stretched across the page. "Man arrested after child found unconscious in his car." David felt the blood drain from his face. That's me," he said quietly. Alvarez nodded. "Your arrest was logged into the public system earlier." David stared at the screen. The article was short, but it didn't need to be long to cause damage. It mentioned his name, his neighborhood, the accusation. David leaned back slowly, feeling sick. "People are going to think I did this," he murmured. The detectives didn't argue, because right now, that's exactly what it looked like. For the next hour, the investigators worked through the details. An officer was sent to David's house to retrieve documents. Eventually, the door opened again. Detective Kim returned holding a small envelope. "Your neighbor helped us access your filing cabinet," she said. Inside the envelope were several papers. David immediately recognized them. The bill of sale from 2 years ago, signed by both him and Tara. Alvarez examined the document carefully. "This shows you transferred the vehicle to Tara Mitchell," he said. "Exactly," David replied. Kim then pulled up another file on the tablet. Mr. Mitchell also provided access to his phone. Several old messages appeared on the screen. Tara's contact name sat at the top of the conversation. One message read clearly, "Don't worry, I'll handle the title transfer tomorrow." Another message followed 2 days later. "DMV appointment next week. I'll take care of everything." Alvarez exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "that's pretty clear." David sat quietly while the detectives reviewed the divorce paperwork as well. The documents confirmed something else important. There were no children listed in the marriage. After several minutes, Alvarez closed the folder. He looked up at David. "Mr. Mitchell, based on this documentation, it appears you did sell the vehicle and reasonably expected the registration to be transferred." David waited. "Which means," he asked. Alvarez nodded. "You're no longer under arrest." The words should have felt like relief. But they didn't. Not entirely. Because even as the detectives removed his file from the case, David knew the damage had already begun. His name had already appeared in the headlines. The accusation had already spread. And later that afternoon, when David finally returned home, he discovered something else waiting for him. An email from his employer. Short, professional, and devastating. Due to the ongoing investigation, he was being placed on temporary leave until further notice. David stared at the message on his screen. Although he was legally cleared, the damage had already started. His employer places him on temporary leave while the investigation continues. His reputation is suddenly under suspicion. Chapter 4. The investigation expands. The days following David's release felt strange and heavy, like walking through a storm that had technically passed but still left dark clouds overhead. He returned to work on Monday morning out of habit. But the moment he stepped into the office building, he could feel it. People were watching him. Not openly, not rudely, just watching. A few coworkers who normally greeted him every morning suddenly avoided eye contact. One man quickly looked down at his phone when David walked past his desk. 2 others stopped talking the moment he entered the break room. David poured himself coffee in silence. The television, mounted in the corner of the room, was playing the local news. He tried not to look, but the headline flashed across the bottom of the screen again. "Man arrested after child found unconscious in vehicle." His jaw tightened. Technically, the report didn't accuse him anymore. The follow-up article mentioned that he had been released pending further investigation. But people remembered the first headline. They always did. Later that morning, his manager called him into the office. "David, close the door, please." The tone already told him this wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. David sat down across from the desk. His manager folded his hands carefully. "You know this situation has drawn some attention." David nodded. "I know. We've received a few calls, the manager continued cautiously. Some customers saw the news story. David felt the familiar frustration rising again. I was cleared, he said. I understand that, the manager replied quickly. But the company still needs to be cautious until the situation fully resolves. David already knew what was coming. For now, the manager said, we're placing you on administrative leave. How long? David asked. Until the investigation concludes. David didn't argue. He simply nodded once and stood up. Understood. The walk back to his car felt longer than usual. The entire situation felt unfair. His name had been dragged into something he had nothing to do with. And the person actually responsible was out there somewhere, probably spinning another version of the story. Tara had always been good at that, twisting the narrative, making herself the victim. Meanwhile, the investigation surrounding the incident was expanding quickly. Child Protective Services opened a formal case within 24 hours. The caseworker assigned to the situation, Angela Brooks, visited the hospital where Marcus Brennan Jr. was recovering. The boy was awake now, though still weak from dehydration and heat exposure. Angela spoke quietly with the attending nurse. How long was he inside the car? Based on the temperature readings and security footage, the nurse replied, probably close to 40 minutes. Angela's expression darkened. That could have been fatal. The nurse nodded grimly. Very easily. Later that afternoon, Angela visited Tara Brennan's apartment. The building itself already raised concerns. Paint peeling from the exterior walls. Trash bins overflowing near the parking lot. Inside, the apartment was cluttered and disorganized. Tara opened the door wearing sunglasses and holding her phone. Are you from CPS? She asked with a sigh. Yes, Angela said calmly. Angela Brooks. I'd like to ask you some questions. Tara rolled her eyes slightly, but stepped aside. Fine, come in. Angela walked through the living room, quietly taking mental notes. Toys scattered across the floor. Dirty dishes piled in the sink. Several unopened bills sitting on the kitchen counter. Can you explain what happened yesterday? Angela asked. Tara leaned against the wall. It was a misunderstanding, she said casually. Angela raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Yes. I thought the car was registered properly. My ex-husband was supposed to finish the paperwork. Angela paused. That's not what I asked about. Tara frowned slightly. I went into the store for a few minutes. I didn't realize it would take that long. How long were you inside? Maybe 15 minutes. Angela glanced down at her notes. Security footage shows you inside the store for 42 minutes. Tara's expression hardened. Well, I didn't check the time. Angela wrote something down. Is there anyone who regularly helps you care for Marcus Jr.? Tara shrugged. Sometimes the neighbors watch him. Which neighbors? The couple downstairs. Or sometimes my friend Kelly. Angela continued writing. How often do you leave him with others? Whenever I need to. Over the next several days, CPS dug deeper, and what they discovered painted a troubling picture. The daycare Marcus Jr. attended reported multiple issues. Late pickups, missed payments. One teacher described Tara as frequently distracted. Another mentioned that the child was often the last one left waiting at the center. Angela spoke with the neighbor Tara had mentioned, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez. Yes, I watch the boys sometimes, the woman admitted. How often? Mrs. Alvarez hesitated. More than I probably should. What do you mean? The woman sighed. She leaves him with me without much warning. Sometimes she says she'll be back in an hour and doesn't return until late evening. Angela's pen moved steadily across her notebook. Meanwhile, someone else had become involved in the situation. Marcus Brennan. We learned what had happened to his son. He drove straight to the hospital. The moment he entered the room and saw Marcus Jr. lying in the bed, pale but breathing, his face tightened with anger. A doctor stepped forward. He's stable, the doctor explained. But he was severely dehydrated. Marcus nodded slowly. How long was he in that car? Too long. Marcus looked down at his son's small hand resting on the hospital blanket. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed Tara. When she answered, his voice was cold. You left my son in a car. It wasn't like that, Tara replied defensively. That's exactly what it was. You're overreacting. Marcus' jaw clenched. He could have died. He didn't. The words hung in the air. Marcus ended the call without another word. Within a week, the case moved into family court. The judge reviewed the reports carefully. Angela Brooks presented the CPS findings. Negligence, irresponsibility, unsafe parenting behavior. Marcus Brennan also testified. "I'm requesting full custody of my son," he told the court firmly. The judge nodded slowly. After reviewing all the evidence, the decision came quickly. Marcus Brennan would receive full custody of Marcus Jr. Tara Brennan would be allowed only supervised visitation under CPS monitoring. David watched the developments unfold through news updates and quiet conversations around town. For a brief moment, he hoped the truth would finally clear his name. But it didn't happen that way. Even though Tara's negligence was exposed, the original story still lingered in people's minds. Neighbors still remembered the police cars in his driveway. Co-workers still remembered the headline. The damage didn't disappear overnight. David sat alone in his living room one evening, staring at his silent phone. His job was still on hold. His reputation still questioned. And Tara had already started blaming him publicly for the situation. That's when a realization finally settled into his mind. If he stayed silent, the story would never change. If he did nothing, Tara's lies would continue shaping the narrative. David leaned forward slowly. His jaw tightened with determination. For 2 years, he had tried to move on peacefully. But now he understood something clearly. Tara's chaos had found him again. And this time, he wasn't going to let it ruin his life. David realizes something important. If he does nothing, Tara's lies will continue to affect his life. So he decides to fight back. Chapter 5, Taking Back Control. For several days after the court ruling that granted Marcus Brennan full custody of his son, David tried to keep his routine as normal as possible. But normal didn't really exist anymore. The garage that once felt peaceful now felt quiet in a different way. The radio still played the same classic rock station. The tools were still arranged neatly on the wall, and the smell of oil and metal still filled the space. Yet David couldn't focus the way he used to. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Some messages were supportive. Others were less kind. One anonymous email simply read, "Maybe next time don't leave kids in hot cars." David deleted it immediately, but the words lingered. The truth was out there somewhere, in police reports, in court documents, in statements that proved he had nothing to do with what happened. But public opinion didn't change as quickly as facts. One afternoon, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. News articles, printed screenshots of comments online, emails from work confirming his continued leave. He rubbed his forehead slowly. "This can't just end like this," he muttered. For 2 years after the divorce, he had tried to stay far away from Tara's chaos. He hadn't spoken to her. He hadn't checked her social media. He hadn't asked mutual friends about her life. He simply moved on. But somehow she had dragged him back into the mess anyway. David leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Then he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts for a moment before stopping on a name a co-worker had recommended earlier that week. Tom Fitzgerald. Attorney David hesitated for a moment. Then he pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. Fitzgerald Law Offices, a woman's voice answered. "Hi," David said. "I'd like to schedule a consultation with Tom Fitzgerald." 2 days later, David sat inside a modest but professional office building downtown. The walls were lined with framed law degrees and shelves filled with thick legal books. Across the desk sat Tom Fitzgerald, a man in his early 50s with gray hair, sharp eyes, and a calm, analytical demeanor. Tom leaned back in his chair, listening carefully as David explained everything. The arrest, the vehicle registration, Tara's accusations, the media headlines. When David finished, the room went quiet for a moment. Tom steepled his fingers together thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "you certainly didn't come here with a small problem." David let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." Tom nodded toward the stack of papers David had brought with him. "Mind if I take a look?" "Go ahead." Tom spent several minutes reviewing the documents. The bill of sale, the text messages, the police report confirming David had been cleared. He flipped through the pages methodically. Finally, he leaned back again. "You handled the sale properly," Tom said. That's what I've been saying, David replied. The issue, Tom continued, is that Tara never completed the title transfer. Legally, the vehicle remained tied to you. David sighed. So, I'm just stuck with the consequences? Tom shook his head slightly. Not necessarily. David looked up. Tom opened a legal notepad and began writing. There are several legal angles we can pursue here. Like what? David asked. Tom began listing them calmly. First, defamation. David frowned slightly. She blamed you publicly, Tom explained, even though the facts show otherwise. That caused damage to your reputation. He wrote another line. Second, emotional distress. David gave a quiet, humorless chuckle. I'd say being arrested in front of your neighbors qualifies. Tom nodded. Third, fraud and misuse of your identity in the vehicle registration. He tapped the pen lightly against the paper. And finally, financial damages caused by the false arrest and media coverage. David leaned forward. So, you're saying I could sue her? Tom met his eyes calmly. I'm saying you have a very strong case. For the first time since the arrest, David felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not frustration, something steadier. Control. I'm not looking for revenge, David said carefully. Tom nodded. That's good. I just want accountability. Tom smiled faintly. That's usually how these cases start. He closed the folder and folded his hands. Before we file anything, though, we need to conduct financial discovery. What does that mean? David asked. We look into Tara's financial situation, Tom explained. Assets, income, property. If we pursue damages, we need to know what she's capable of paying. David nodded slowly. That makes sense. Tom stood up. I'll have my team start digging. A week later, David returned to Tom's office. Tom was already waiting when he arrived, holding another file. I found something interesting, the lawyer said. David sat down. Good interesting or bad interesting? Tom opened the file. Depends how you look at it. He slid a document across the desk. David read the summary quickly. Then his eyebrows lifted. What is this? Tom leaned back. Tara Brennan recently inherited money from her grandmother's estate. David looked back down at the number printed on the page. $85,000, that's the full amount she received, Tom explained. David stared at the number for a moment. $85,000. The number sat there quietly on the page, but it carried weight. That's convenient, David said slowly. Tom nodded. If we pursue a civil lawsuit, that inheritance is likely considered available assets. David leaned back in his chair, thinking. The arrest, the humiliation, the weeks of stress, the damage to his reputation, the forced leave from work, all because Tara had refused to complete one simple responsibility. Or worse, because she simply didn't care. How much would you recommend we sue for? David asked. Tom tilted his head slightly. That depends on how aggressively you want to pursue the case. David looked at the document again. $85,000. The exact amount Tara had received. He exhaled slowly. Let's make it simple, he said. Tom raised an eyebrow. How so? David pushed the document slightly forward across the desk. That number. Tom glanced at it. 85,000. David nodded once. That's what she inherited. And David met the lawyer's eyes. That's exactly what she cost me. Tom studied him carefully for a moment. Then a faint smile appeared. All right, he wrote the number down on the legal pad. $85,000. We'll file the lawsuit requesting full compensation for damages, Tom said. David stood up, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time since the police had pulled into his driveway that morning, something felt different. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was acting. For the first time since the arrest, David felt like he had control again. Chapter 6, The Discovery That Changes Everything. The legal process moved slowly at first. For David, the days began blending together. Phone calls with his lawyer, long email threads, and stacks of documents that seemed to grow larger every week. But Tom Fitzgerald had warned him about this. Discovery takes time, Tom had said during one of their meetings. But it's where the truth usually shows up. David didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. He would soon learn. 2 weeks after filing the civil lawsuit, David sat in Tom's office again. The room looked the same as before. Neat desk, legal books lining the shelves, and a large window overlooking the busy downtown street below. But this time Tom's expression was different. More focused. More serious. He closed the office door behind David. "Take a seat," Tom said. David sat down slowly. "Something wrong?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a thick folder on the desk. "We've started receiving documents from Tara's legal team," he explained. "That's part of discovery." "Exactly." Tom pulled out several papers and spread them across the desk. "At first, we were only looking for evidence related to the vehicle's sale," he continued. David nodded. "Right, but what we're finding goes far beyond that." David frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Tom slid the first document forward. "This is an insurance policy for the SUV." David glanced at it. His name appeared clearly near the top of the page. "Primary driver, David Mitchell." David blinked. "That's not right." Tom nodded. "That policy was active for nearly 18 months. David looked up. "I didn't sign that." "We know," Tom replied calmly. "Ow!" Tom pointed to the signature line. "Compare this to your real signature." David leaned forward. The handwriting looked similar, but not quite right. The strokes were uneven. Certain letters looked forced. "That's not mine," David said firmly. Tom nodded again. "Our handwriting expert agrees." David leaned back in his chair. "You're saying she forged my signature?" "Looks that way." Tom slid another document across the desk. "This one is a vehicle registration update request." David stared at it. Once again, his name appeared in the owner's section. But the address listed underneath was different. It was Tara's apartment address. David felt his stomach tighten. "She used my name, but her address?" Tom tapped the page. "Exactly." David rubbed his forehead. "So she kept the car registered under my identity, but routed everything to herself." "That's what it appears." Tom flipped through another set of papers. And it didn't stop there. David watched as Tom laid out more documents. Insurance renewals. Registration forms. Service contracts. Each one carried David's name. Each one had a suspicious signature. And every single one was connected to the vehicle Tara had been driving. "How long did this go on?" David asked quietly. Tom checked the dates. "Almost 2 years." David stared at the desk. 2 years. The entire time he had been rebuilding his life, Tara had been quietly using his identity behind the scenes. "For what?" he asked finally. Tom shrugged slightly. "Convenience, probably. Maybe lower insurance rates. Maybe easier paperwork." David let out a bitter laugh. "So, she just pretended I still owned the car." "More or less." David leaned back again, trying to process it. "This is fraud, isn't it?" Tom nodded slowly. "It certainly looks like it." David sat in silence for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him since the beginning. "What about the day of the incident?" Tom reached for another document. "We've been investigating that as well." He pulled out a printed transcript. "These came from Tara's phone." David leaned forward again. "Where did you get those?" "Her legal team had to provide them during discovery," Tom explained. "They tried to argue privacy issues, but since the messages are directly related to the incident, the court allowed access." Tom slid the transcript toward him. "Take a look." David read the first message. It was sent about 15 minutes before Tara entered the shopping center. "Tara, I'm running into the store real quick." A response followed from someone saved as Kelly. "Kelly, you have Marcus with you?" "Tara, yeah. He's asleep in the car." David's chest tightened. He kept reading. "Kelly, you're leaving him in the car?" A pause. Then Tara replied. "Tara, relax. I'll be like 20 minutes. David's jaw clenched. Tom pointed to the next message. This one came 27 minutes later. "Kelly, are you still in there?" "Tara, yeah. The line is long, lol." David slowly set the paper down. "She knew," he said quietly. Tom nodded. "She absolutely knew." David shook his head in disbelief. "She didn't forget him." "No, she didn't accidentally leave him." "No." Tom leaned forward slightly. "She made a deliberate decision to leave a 3-year-old child alone in a locked vehicle while she went shopping." David stared at the transcript again. The casual tone of the messages made it even worse. No panic, no concern, just indifference. "She could have killed him," David muttered. Tom didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "There's something else you should know." David looked up. "I've already shared this information with the district attorney's office." "What?" David asked. Tom folded his hands. because this situation is no longer just a civil dispute. David felt a cold chill move through him. What do you mean? Tom met his eyes directly. Forgery, identity misuse, financial deception, and evidence of intentional child endangerment. He paused. That's criminal territory. David sat silently as the realization settled in. For weeks, he had been focused on clearing his name. But what Tom was describing was something much bigger. Tara hadn't just caused a misunderstanding. She had built an entire web of lies, using his name, using his identity, and risking a child's life in the process. Tom closed the folder slowly. I expect law enforcement will be reviewing this evidence very soon. David exhaled slowly. The lawsuit had started as a way to reclaim his reputation, but now it had uncovered something far darker, something far more serious. Suddenly the case becomes far more serious, and law enforcement begins investigating Tara for additional criminal charges. Chapter 7. Everything falls apart. The moment the new evidence reached the district attorney's office, the situation around Tara Brennan began to unravel with startling speed. For months, Tara had been moving through life the same way she always had, confident, defensive, and convinced that she could talk her way out of almost any problem. But this time, the problem wasn't an argument or a broken relationship. It was evidence. And evidence didn't care about excuses. 3 weeks after Tom Fitzgerald forwarded the discovery documents to prosecutors, David received a call early one morning. He was sitting in his garage again, trying to focus on repairing a truck engine, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. The screen showed Tom Fitzgerald. David wiped his hands on a rag and answered, "Morning, Tom." Tom's voice sounded serious. "David, I thought you'd want to hear this directly." David leaned against the workbench. "About the case?" "Yes." There was a brief pause. "The district attorney has decided to move forward with criminal charges." David's brow tightened. "Against Tara?" "Yes." "What kind of charges?" Tom exhaled quietly. "Fraud, identity misuse, forgery, and evidence related to the child endangerment incident." David didn't speak for a moment. The garage suddenly felt quieter than usual. "So, it's actually happening," he said finally. "It is." David slowly nodded to himself. For weeks he had been preparing for the civil lawsuit. But hearing that Tara now faced criminal charges was something else entirely. "When does this start?" he asked. "Soon," Tom replied. "And based on the evidence we uncovered, prosecutors seem very confident." David ended the call a few minutes later, standing silently in the garage. For the first time since the police cars had pulled into his driveway that morning, he felt like the truth was finally beginning to catch up with Tara. Across town, Tara was experiencing the same news in a very different way. 2 detectives arrived at her apartment late that afternoon. She opened the door halfway, already annoyed. "Yes, Ms. Tara Brennan," one detective asked. "What is this about?" "We need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation." Tara sighed dramatically. "Can this wait? I'm busy." The detective calmly held up a folder. "I'm afraid it can't." Within minutes, Tara was sitting at her small kitchen table while the detectives explained the situation. Forgery, identity misuse, fraud connected to vehicle registration and insurance. Tara crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." The detective slid copies of the documents across the table. "Are you saying these signatures aren't yours?" Tara looked at the papers briefly before pushing them away. "My ex-husband is trying to ruin my life. That's not what we asked. He's bitter about the divorce." The detective remained calm. "We also have your text messages regarding the day your child was left in the vehicle." Tara's expression stiffened. "That was a misunderstanding. The messages suggest otherwise." The conversation ended with a simple statement. "Ms. Brennan, the district attorney's office will be filing formal charges." For the first time, Tara looked genuinely nervous. The fallout began almost immediately. Within days, Child Protective Services updated the custody ruling regarding Marcus Brennan Jr. Angela Brooks. The CPS investigator contacted Marcus Brennan directly. "We've reviewed the new evidence," she explained. Marcus listened carefully. "And we're suspending Tara's visitation rights until further notice." Marcus looked down at his son, playing on the floor nearby. "Understood." For him, The decision wasn't surprising, but it was still heavy. At the same time, Tara's professional life collapsed. Her employer had been following the news carefully. The moment the criminal investigation became public, the company's HR department requested a meeting. Tara walked into the conference room, expecting another routine discussion. Instead, two executives and an HR manager were waiting. The HR manager spoke gently but firmly. "Tara, due to the serious nature of the investigation involving fraud and identity misuse, the company has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." Tara stared at them. "You can't do that." "Actually, we can. This is discrimination." "No," the executive replied calmly. "This is risk management." Within 10 minutes, Tara was escorted out of the building carrying a small box of her belongings. Even her legal defense began to collapse. The attorney she had hired early in the investigation had initially been confident. But once the full discovery documents appeared, particularly the forged signatures and text messages, his confidence faded. During a tense meeting in his office, he finally spoke plainly. "Tara, the evidence against you is substantial. So you're just giving up?" she snapped. "I'm advising you to consider cooperation." "I'm not pleading guilty to anything." The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "In that case, I will be withdrawing from your representation." Tara stared at him. "You're quitting?" "I'm protecting my professional reputation." A week later, Tara sat across from David for the first time in over 2 years. The meeting took place inside a quiet conference room at Tom Fitzgerald's office. A mediator sat between them while both sides reviewed settlement options. Tara looked tired. Her hair was pulled back messily, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. But the bitterness in her voice was still familiar. "This whole lawsuit is ridiculous," she muttered. David said nothing. Tom slid a document across the table. "This is the civil claim for damages." Tara glanced at it briefly before scoffing. $85,000? Are you serious? David remained calm. "You caused serious damage to my life." "You're exaggerating." "You had me arrested," he replied quietly. "That wasn't my fault. You blamed me publicly." Tara rolled her eyes. "I'll give you $10,000, she said suddenly. The mediator raised an eyebrow. "To settle everything." David didn't even hesitate. "No." Tara leaned back in her chair. "That's a generous offer." David folded his hands calmly. "I know about the inheritance." The room went silent. Tara's expression changed instantly. "What inheritance?" she asked sharply. "The $85,000 you received from your grandmother's estate." Her face went pale. Tom leaned forward slightly. "That amount represents the damages caused by Ms. Brennan's actions." Tara stared across the table. "You're trying to take everything I have." David met her gaze evenly. "No." He tapped the document. "I'm asking for exactly what you cost me." The negotiations dragged on for hours. Arguments. Whispers between attorneys. Several breaks. But the numbers never changed. Finally, late in the afternoon, Tara slumped back in her chair. "Fine," she muttered. The mediator looked up. "Are you agreeing to the settlement?" Tara avoided David's eyes. "Yes." David sat quietly as the paperwork was prepared. For years, he had known Tara as someone who always controlled the narrative. Someone who always twisted situations to her advantage. But now the balance had shifted. For the first time since he had met her, Tara Brennan looked like someone who had run out of control. For the first time, David sees her without control over the situation. Chapter 8. The Hidden Crimes. David believed the worst of the situation was already behind him. The settlement with Tara had been signed, the civil lawsuit resolved, and for the first time in months, his life felt like it might finally begin returning to normal. He was still on leave from work, but his manager had recently called to say the company was reviewing his return. Things were slowly moving forward. But what David didn't know yet was that the investigation into Tara Brennan was only beginning to uncover the full truth. And the truth was far worse than anyone expected. One morning, about 2 weeks after the settlement meeting, David received another call from Tom Fitzgerald. David had just finished making coffee when his phone rang. He answered casually. "Hey, Tom." Tom's voice sounded unusually serious. "David, are you sitting down?" David frowned slightly. "Yeah, why?" "There's something you need to hear." David leaned against the kitchen counter. What happened? Tom paused briefly. The police investigation into Tara didn't stop with a vehicle registration fraud. David's brow tightened. What do you mean? They kept digging into how she was using your identity. David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. And Tom exhaled slowly. They've uncovered a lot more. Later that afternoon, David sat inside a conference room at Tom's office again. A thick stack of printed reports sat in the center of the table. Tom pushed the folder toward him. These came from the investigators working with the district attorney's office. David opened the folder carefully. The first page was a summary report. As he began reading, his expression slowly shifted from confusion to disbelief. "This can't be real," he murmured. Tom folded his arms. "It is." David flipped to the next page. One document after another listed financial accounts, applications, and contracts, all connected to his name. But none of them were his. "Start with the credit cards," Tom said. David scanned the page. 3 separate credit accounts had been opened over the past 2 years, each one under David Mitchell's name, each one tied to addresses he had never lived at. His voice tightened. "I never opened any of these." "We know," Tom said. David flipped to another document. Apartment leases. 2 different rental agreements, signed with his name. One for Tara's previous apartment, another for a short-term rental unit across town. David looked up in disbelief. "She used my identity to rent apartments?" Tom nodded. "Yes." David ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane." Tom pointed toward another section of the report. "It doesn't stop there." David continued reading. Insurance policies. Several of them. Auto insurance. Renter's insurance. Even a short-term health policy. Each one listed David Mitchell as the policyholder. Even worse, the applications included detailed employment information, David's job title, company name, and salary estimates. David felt a cold chill. "How did she get all this?" Tom shrugged slightly. "You were married for years. She had access to most of that information already." David leaned back slowly. "But this is identity theft." Tom nodded calmly. "Yes, and not a small amount of it." David flipped through the documents faster now. Every page revealed another misuse of his name. Another contract. Another financial record. Another forged signature. Then he reached a page that made his stomach drop. A mail forwarding request, filed through the Postal Service, submitted under David's name. The request had redirected certain financial mail to Tara's address for almost 8 months. David stared at it in disbelief. "She redirected my mail?" "Yes," Tom said. "That's how she accessed financial statements and verification documents needed for the credit applications." David closed the folder slowly. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the table. "I had no idea," he said quietly. Tom nodded. "That's the nature of identity theft. It usually happens quietly." David exhaled heavily. "How much damage are we talking about?" Tom turned a page in the report. The financial investigators estimate roughly $45,000 in fraudulent accounts connected to your identity. David's eyes widened. 45,000? Most of the balances remain unpaid. David shook his head slowly. "So I could have been responsible for all that. If it hadn't been discovered, yes." The room fell silent. For 2 years, Tara had been living her life while secretly building an entire financial structure under his name, all while blaming him publicly for the car incident. David finally spoke again. "How did the police even find all of this?" Tom tapped the report. Once they confirmed the forged signatures related to the vehicle registration, they expanded the investigation into other possible identity misuse. And they subpoenaed financial institutions. David nodded slowly. And that's when everything showed up. Exactly. The next phase of the investigation moved quickly. Financial crime detectives began compiling the evidence. Bank records, credit applications, lease agreements, insurance policies. Every document carried David's name. Every signature matched the same forged handwriting. When investigators finally presented the full evidence to the district attorney's office, the reaction was immediate. One prosecutor reportedly said, "This is one of the most thorough identity fraud cases we've seen tied to a domestic relationship." The charges were filed the following week. 17 separate counts. Fraud, identity theft, forgery, mail fraud, financial deception, each charge connected to a specific document or financial account. The scale of the case shocked even the detectives who had been working on it. What had started as a child endangerment investigation had uncovered a massive pattern of criminal activity. When Tara Brennan's new defense attorney reviewed the full evidence, his reaction was immediate. He scheduled a private meeting with her the next morning. Tara sat across from him in the small conference room, arms crossed tightly. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. The lawyer slid the evidence file across the table. "Have you reviewed the charges? I know what they're accusing me of. They have documentation for every count." Tara looked away. "They're exaggerating." The lawyer leaned forward slightly. "Tara, this evidence is overwhelming. They can't prove I did it. They already have." He tapped the stack of papers. "Your text messages, the forged signatures, the financial records." Tara said nothing. The lawyer exhaled slowly. "You need to seriously consider negotiating with the prosecutors." "For what?" "A plea agreement." Tara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to prison." The lawyer met her gaze calmly. "With 17 criminal charges, prison is a very real possibility." The room fell silent. For the first time since the entire situation began, Tara Brennan looked genuinely afraid. Facing overwhelming evidence, she negotiates a plea agreement. Chapter 9. Justice finally arrives. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet rustle of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. David Mitchell sat in the back row, his hands resting on his knees, trying to steady the mixture of relief and lingering tension he felt. 2 years of chaos, lies, and false accusations had led to this moment, and now it all came down to the judge's decision. Across the room, Tara Brennan sat at the defense table, her head lowered, her expensive attorney conspicuously absent. The evidence against her had been overwhelming: forged signatures, identity theft, text messages proving intentional child endangerment, and a long trail of financial fraud. There was no way out. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elaine Carmichael, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, "the defendant has pleaded guilty to 12 counts of fraud and identity theft. The severity of these crimes is significant, not just in financial damage, but in the deliberate harm caused to Mr. David Mitchell's life." David could barely sit still. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, imagining the closure he would finally receive. The judge, a stern but fair man named Judge Reynolds, adjusted his glasses and looked down at Tara. "Ms. Brennan," he began, "the court has reviewed the evidence in detail. Your actions were not only illegal, but deliberately deceptive, causing emotional and financial harm to Mr. Mitchell. In addition, your reckless behavior endangered a child's life." Tara's lips pressed into a thin line. She avoided David's gaze entirely. "Given the gravity of your crimes, the court sentences you to 3 years in state prison," Judge Reynolds declared. David exhaled quietly, feeling the weight of tension leave his shoulders. "In addition," the judge continued, "you are ordered to provide full financial restitution to Mr. Mitchell for the damages caused by your fraudulent actions, and a permanent restraining order is issued to prevent any contact with him." David felt a strange mix of relief and vindication. Justice finally had arrived. After the hearing, David stepped outside into the brisk autumn air. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and microphones hovered, but he ignored them. For once, the story being told publicly was true. The media would finally report facts instead of sensationalized accusations. Later that evening, David scrolled through online news articles. Headlines flashed across the screen, catching his attention immediately. "Wrongfully accused man cleared after ex-wife's fraud exposed." "Ex-husband vindicated as identity theft case unfolds." The words felt surreal. After months of stress, humiliation, and damage to his reputation, the narrative had finally shifted in his favor. The next morning, David received a call from his employer. "David, good news," his manager said, voice warm. "We've reviewed the situation, and you're cleared to return to work immediately." In fact, there was a brief pause. "We'd like to discuss a promotion." David's heart skipped a beat. "A promotion?" "Yes. his manager confirmed. "We recognize how you handled yourself professionally through this ordeal. Your position and contributions warrant advancement." David smiled quietly, a rare moment of happiness. The validation of his career, combined with the legal resolution, felt like life finally catching up with him. Several weeks later, David received an unexpected phone call at home. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello," he answered. "Hi, David. This is Marcus Brennan." David froze for a moment. Marcus Brennan, the father of the boy who had been left in the car during Tara's reckless shopping spree. "Marcus," David said cautiously. "I just wanted to call and apologize." Marcus said, voice heavy with sincerity. "I trusted Tara, and I should have been more careful. I can't imagine what you went through. I just wanted you to know that my son is now healthy and thriving. We're doing well, thanks in large part to you." David felt warmth in his chest, a validation that went beyond legal victories or media headlines. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "It means a lot." Marcus chuckled lightly. "I hope one day Marcus Jr. can meet you properly. He's heard so much about you already." David smiled quietly. "I'd like that." They spoke for a few more minutes, exchanging polite words and well wishes. It felt normal, peaceful. A few days later, David checked his mailbox and found a small envelope with familiar handwriting. Inside was a handwritten card. David opened it carefully. The paper was simple, but the message was heartfelt. "My dad says you're a good man." David smiled softly. His eyes misted slightly, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a sense of calm wash over him. He placed the card on his desk, looking out the window at the neighborhood he had fought so hard to reclaim. The memories of police cars, public humiliation, and Tara's manipulations seemed almost distant now. For years, he had been on edge, always wary of the next twist, the next lie. Now, the storm had passed. The combination of justice, restitution, and personal acknowledgement gave him something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. David leaned back in his chair, letting himself breathe fully for the first time in what felt like ages. He wasn't just legally vindicated. He wasn't just publicly cleared. He was finally free from the chaos Tara had brought into his life. And for the first time in years, David smiled without a trace of fear or doubt. Peace. Chapter 10, A New Beginning. The spring sunlight poured through the blinds of David Mitchell's modest living room as he sipped his morning coffee. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet and safe. Not because nothing had happened, but because the storm that had dominated his life for so long was finally behind him. Then the phone rang. David set his mug down carefully, wiping his hands on a towel before answering. "David Mitchell," he said. "Mr. Mitchell, this is the parole office," a formal voice replied. "We're contacting you regarding Tara Brennan. She has filed for early parole, and, as the victim in the case, you are invited to submit a statement." David felt a flicker of irritation, but he took a deep breath to steady himself. "Of course," he said calmly. "I'll prepare a statement." The next several days were spent compiling his thoughts. David wanted to ensure every detail was clear and factual. He sat at his desk, opening a blank document on his laptop, and began typing. "Tara Brennan's actions were deliberate, calculated, and caused me severe emotional, financial, and reputational harm." He went on to outline the events, the false arrest and public humiliation, the forged vehicle documents, the text messages, proving intentional child endangerment, the misuse of his identity for financial gain. Each sentence was precise, unemotional, and unyielding in its truth. After hours of editing, David read the statement aloud. His voice wavered only slightly when he described the impact on his life, sleepless nights, the damage to his reputation, and a lingering fear that someone might believe Tara's lies over his truth. Finally, he printed the statement, signed it, and sent it to the parole board. 2 weeks later, David received a letter. He opened it carefully. "After review of your statement and the full case files, the parole board has decided to deny the request for early parole filed by Tara Brennan." David exhaled slowly. Relief washed over him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The system had finally recognized the severity of Tara's actions. At the same time, a separate envelope arrived from the court. It contained $43,712 in restitution payments. The portion of financial damages Tara was ordered to pay for the identity theft and fraud she had committed. David held the check in his hands for a long moment. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about what it represented. Accountability, justice, the tangible recognition that the wrongs committed against him would not be ignored. That weekend, David drove around town, searching for something he hadn't even realized he was looking for, a fresh start. He passed quiet streets lined with trees, glimpsed kids playing in yards, and noticed the calm hum of suburban life. He imagined himself living somewhere like this, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of Tara's chaos. After a week of searching, he found it. A small, single-story house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac in a quiet neighborhood. The exterior was simple but welcoming. The lawn was neat, and the neighbors waved from their porches as he walked around a yard. David felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Moving day arrived. David stood in his old home, the place where the nightmare had begun. He looked around the living room, noting the worn coffee table, the scuffed floors, and the garage where he had once worked in peace. This was where police cars had pulled into his driveway, where reporters had gathered, where his life had been publicly questioned and humiliated. He paused in the doorway, letting the memories wash over him. "This is it," he whispered to himself. The end of that chapter. He picked up a small box of personal items, photos, books, letters, and carried it to the car. Neighbors watched curiously as he loaded the moving van, some offering nods and quiet congratulations. David waved politely, feeling the weight of years of scrutiny and judgment finally lift just a little. By midday, the moving van was packed. David took one last look around the house. He walked to the front door, ran his hand over the frame, and breathed in deeply. "This house," he murmured, "was part of my past, not my future." He turned the key in the lock for the last time. The click echoed in the empty space. David held the door handle for a moment longer, letting the finality of it sink in. Then he closed the door. The drive to the new house was quiet. The sun was high, birds chirped in the trees lining the streets, and the hum of the engine seemed soothing rather than stressful. David felt lighter than he had in years. Pulling into the driveway, he noticed the neatly trimmed bushes, the clean exterior, and the small mailbox by the street. This was his new beginning, a space entirely his own. No chaos, no lies, no unexpected visits from law enforcement. Just a place to breathe and live on his terms. He carried the first boxes inside, unpacking slowly, setting things in place with careful attention. The walls felt empty, but in a comforting way. They weren't haunted by past accusations or manipulations. They were blank canvases for the life he wanted to create. That evening, David sat on the back porch, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The wind rustled gently through the trees, and he sipped a cup of tea, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't known for years. He reflected on the journey, the betrayal, the arrest, the months of stress, and finally, the vindication. Every confrontation with Tara, every legal battle, every late night reviewing documents, it had all led him here. And now, for the first time, the future felt open. No one could touch his reputation. No one could manipulate his life. No one could make him feel powerless again. David closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of evening settling in. Peace wasn't just an idea anymore. It was real, tangible, something he could hold on to. Over the next few days, David unpacked and arranged the new house exactly as he wanted it. Each room became a reflection of his new life, simple, functional, and peaceful. He hung photos of friends and family who had supported him, stacked books he loved, and placed a small potted plant on the windowsill, a symbol of growth and renewal. He even set up a small workbench in the garage, like the one he had left behind, but this one felt different. No memories of fear or humiliation lingered here. This was a space for creation and focus, not chaos. On the evening of the first full week in his new home, David stood outside once more, taking a deep breath. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. He thought about the past, the police cars, the news reports, the lawsuits, the betrayal. And he realized something. All of it was behind him now. His life finally belonged to him. David smiled softly, feeling the freedom he had longed for years. He closed the front door behind him, walked to his car, and drove slowly down the quiet street. No looking back, no regrets, only a future he could build on his own terms. The chaos was over. The fear was gone. And at last, David Mitchell could breathe. For the first time in years, his life truly belonged to him again.